two men stood on opposite ends of World War II's most brutal chessboard, both brilliant, both feared, both obsessed with victory. One commanded speed like lightning, believing war was won by movement and shock. The other commanded steel and patience, trusting that endurance could break even the fiercest storm. Their names, Heinz Guderian and Georgy Zhukov, two of the greatest minds in modern warfare. History remembers their clash, not as a single battle, but as a collision of philosophies that shaped the fate of nations. Guderian's tanks rolled like thunder across Europe, rewriting the rules of combat, while Zhukov's armies turned human willpower into an impenetrable wall. It wasn't just about tanks or trenches. It was about who could read the enemy SE mind faster. The world watched as one tried to move faster than thought itself, while the other waited for the perfect moment to strike back. But here's the question that still sparks debate among historians and strategists alike. Asterisk, did Zhukov truly outsmart Guderian? Or did fate simply turn against the Germans? Asterisk, was it intellect that crushed the blitzkrieg, or exhaustion, arrogance, and weather? When the unstoppable force of Guderian's blitz met the unbreakable wall of Zhukov's defense, the result wasn't just a battle. It was a revelation of how wars are truly won. The truth behind this face-off is far more complex, more human, and more haunting than most people realize. To understand this duel, we must first understand the men behind the medals. Heinz Guderian wasn't just another German general. He was the architect of Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that terrified Europe. His philosophy was built on movement, precision, and surprise. Strike fast, strike hard, and never let the enemy recover. He saw war not as endurance, but as momentum, a deadly dance where hesitation meant death. On the other side stood Georgy Zhukov, a man forged in hardship, discipline, and resilience. He was everything Guderian wasn't: cautious, calculating, and deeply patient. Where Guderian trusted innovation, Zhukov trusted preparation. His strength came not from speed, but from the ability to absorb blows and still keep standing. To his soldiers, he was the embodiment of Soviet endurance, a commander who demanded everything and gave everything in return. Their philosophies could not have been more different. Guderian believed a war could be won before the enemy even understood what hit them. Zhukov believed a war could only be won by breaking the enemy's spirit, no matter the cost. One relied on the power of the machine, the other relied on the will of men. When their strategies collided during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the outcome would redefine the future of the Eastern Front and the fate of World War II itself. This was not just a test of armies, it was a test of minds. Could Guderian's rapid-fire genius break through Zhukov's immovable logic, or would Zhukov's patience and discipline grind down the most terrifying war machine Europe had ever seen? The answer lies buried beneath the snow, in the wreckage of tanks and the silence of soldiers who learned that sometimes brains not bullets decide who truly wins a war. When the German invasion of the Soviet Union began on June 22, 1941, the world witnessed an explosion of speed and destruction unlike anything before. At the center of it stood Heinz Guderian, commanding his armored spearheads with mathematical precision. His blitzkrieg doctrine had already crushed France and Poland with shocking efficiency. The idea was simple: overwhelm the enemy before they could even think. The Germans advanced so fast that Soviet divisions often didn't even know they were encircled until it was too late. As Guderian's panzers cut through Belarus and Smolensk, it seemed nothing could stop the storm. Soviet airfields burned, command posts vanished, and entire armies were swallowed by German invasion. Stalin refused to believe his empire was collapsing so quickly, issuing orders detached from the reality on the ground. Guderian's success wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The Blitzkrieg created terror and confusion, forcing opponents to react instead of plan. To many in the German high command, it looked as if the Soviet Union would fall in a matter of weeks. But deep within the chaos, a new figure began to emerge. Georgy Zhukov, recently appointed to organize Soviet defenses around Moscow. Unlike many Soviet commanders who panicked, Zhukov observed. He studied the patterns of German movement, the weaknesses behind their speed, and the logistics that fueled their advance. Where others saw an unstoppable machine, Zhukov saw a system that could be broken. Every kilometer Guderian gained stretched his supply lines thinner and slowed his tanks a little more. Zhukov began building defense layers not to stop the Germans instantly, but to make every step forward costly. By late summer, Guderian's momentum began to fade. Soviet forces no longer disintegrated on contact, they fell back strategically, drawing the Germans deeper into the vast, unforgiving Russian landscape. The roads turned into rivers of mud, the weather shifted, and the promised quick victory started slipping away. Zhukov reinforced his positions, reorganized his troops, and coordinated counterstrikes that targeted weak German flanks. For the first time, Blitzkrieg's lightning seemed to flicker. Hitler, frustrated by what he saw as hesitation, pushed Guderian harder, demanding he capture Moscow before winter. But even a genius strategist cannot fight nature, exhaustion, and stretched logistics all at once. As Guderian's tanks sputtered in the freezing cold, Zhukov prepared for something the Germans had never faced before. A counteroffensive born not from chaos, but from calculation. The storm of Blitzkrieg had broken upon the iron wall of the Soviet defense, and for the first time, Guderian realized that speed alone might not be enough to win this war. Zhukov understood that brute strength could not beat Blitzkrieg, but intelligence could. He saw Guderian's strategy for what it was, an incredible machine dependent on flawless coordination and supply. Disrupt either, and the system would collapse. Zhukov began to manipulate tempo itself, while Guderian thrived on rhythm and pace. Zhukov sought to break it, forcing the Germans into conditions where their own doctrine worked against them. He ordered troops to retreat strategically, pulling the Germans deeper into hostile terrain, far from their fuel and food. Every step Guderian took forward, Zhukov turned into a trap. Bridges were blown, villages burned, and communication lines severed. What once was a straight road to victory became a maze of ambushes and attrition. Guderian's frustration grew as his tanks ran low on fuel and spare parts, yet the orders from Hitler were clear. No retreat, no delay. The more the German forces pushed, the more they lost their flexibility, the one thing that made Blitzkrieg unbeatable. By November, the weather turned against Guderian. Temperatures dropped below freezing, engines stalled, and morale collapsed. Zhukov, in contrast, had timed his move perfectly. Reinforcements from Siberia, hardened by the cold and well-equipped, began arriving. Using intelligence and psychological warfare, Zhukov spread rumors of massive Soviet reserves waiting behind Moscow. The German soldiers, already exhausted, began to fear an invisible army that might strike at any moment. Then, in December 1941, Zhukov launched his counteroffensive. It wasn't just a battle, it was a mental reversal. For the first time, Guderian's forces were on the defensive, retreating under pressure from a commander who had spent months studying their every weakness. Zhukov's attacks were precise, targeting supply lines and overextended divisions. The German front wavered, then buckled. Guderian wanted to withdraw and regroup, but Hitler refused, calling him a coward. Zhukov didn't need to defeat Guderian directly. He let Hitler's stubbornness do it for him. This was the brilliance of Zhukov's mind games. He fought not only the German army, but the German command structure itself. By turning speed into a liability and ego into an enemy, Zhukov had achieved what no one in Europe had. He made Blitzkrieg bleed. At the heart of this confrontation was more than just strategy. It was ideology versus ideology. Guderian represented the German obsession with perfection, order, and precision. His Blitzkrieg was a reflection of that belief. Wars could be won by flawless coordination, if only the machine ran smoothly. Zhukov, on the other hand, symbolized the resilience and sacrifice, the idea that no machine could outlast human will. Their war became a contest of philosophy as much as firepower. Both men were military geniuses trapped by politics. Guderian's relationship with Hitler had always been tense. He was bold enough to argue with the Führer, questioning orders that made no sense. Hitler, however, saw disagreement as disloyalty. Zhukov, too, often clashed with Stalin, especially when he demanded resources or refused suicidal attacks. But Stalin, unlike Hitler, learned to respect Zhukov's results, even if he feared his independence. As the months passed, the difference between their worlds became clear. Guderian's command structure was crumbling under Hitler's obsession with personal control. Strategic decisions turned into emotional ones. Zhukov, by contrast, gained more autonomy as victories mounted. His ability to turn chaos into order impressed even Stalin's harshest advisors. The two generals never met face to face, yet through their actions they waged a silent duel of intellect and endurance. Blitzkrieg, once a symbol of German invincibility, began to lose its shine. The Soviet counteroffensives proved that speed had limits when faced with endless manpower, brutal weather, and a commander who understood timing better than anyone. Guderian's faith in mobility had given the Wehrmacht an edge early in the war, but by 1943, the Soviets had adapted. They learned how to counter speed with anticipation. Zhukov's strategy evolved from survival to dominance. By 1943, the tide of war had decisively turned. Guderian, once hailed as Germany's armored genius, found himself sidelined, frustrated by Hitler's reckless interference. Zhukov, meanwhile, had become the Soviet Union's most trusted commander, orchestrating victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond. The irony was unmistakable. The man who built Blitzkrieg now watched as his own creation was used against him by the Red Army, refined and reversed by Zhukov's strategic mind. Zhukov's greatest weapon wasn't technology, but patience. He had learned from every German move, adapting his armies into flexible, coordinated forces that could both defend and strike. When the Battle of Kursk erupted in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Zhukov applied every lesson learned from Guderian himself. He built layered defenses, traps, and counteroffensives that neutralized the German advantage in mobility. Guderian's successor tried to replicate Blitzkrieg's brilliance, but this chimie, it was met with a commander who had already mastered the rhythm of his enemy. The result was catastrophic for Germany. The Soviets absorbed the initial blow, then counterattacked with overwhelming force. Tanks burned, lines shattered, and for the first time, the German army faced a complete strategic reversal. Zhukov's calculated patience paid off. The hunter had become the hunter. Forg Guderian. This was the final humiliation. He was dismissed, reinstated, and dismissed again As Hitler's paranoia deepened, his doctrines were blamed for failures that weren't his fault, while his warnings went unheard. Zhukov, by contrast, marched triumphantly into Berlin in 1945, leading the final assault that ended the war in Europe. The contrast was poetic. The man who once stood in defense of Moscow now stood victorious in the capital of his former enemy. When we look back, it's tempting to call it a battle of brains. And in a way, it was. Guderian was a visionary who revolutionized warfare, but his genius was bound by the arrogance of his leaders. Zhukov was a survivor who learned, adapted, and evolved beyond his enemy's imagination. If Guderian was the spark that lit the storm, Zhukov was the one who learned how to control it. In that, he didn't just outsmart his rival, he redefined what victory truly meant. So, did Zhukov truly outsmart Guderian? The answer isn't as simple as victory or defeat. Guderian was a genius of innovation, a man who reimagined modern warfare and gave Germany its most terrifying weapon: speed. But speed, by its nature, burns out fast. Zhukov, on the other hand, was a master of endurance, a man who understood that real strength lies in surviving the storm, not outrunning it. Guderian's brilliance shone brightest when everything went according to plan. Zhukov's genius emerged when nothing did. One built his reputation on movement, the other on patience. One trusted machines, the other trusted men. When Blitzkrieg struck Soviet soil, it was unstoppable for a time, but Zhukov's methodical, relentless thinking exposed its single fatal flaw: dependency. Once the German system was stretched beyond its limits, its own strength became its weakness. Zhukov didn't need to destroy Blitzkrieg, he simply let it destroy itself. In truth, neither man lost in intellect, both were prisoners of ideology. Guderian's logic was strong-led by Hitler's arrogance, just as Zhukov's humanity was often buried beneath Stalin's demands. Yet history favored the one who could adapt, endure, and evolve. When Guderian's war machine stalled, Zhukov's mind kept moving. That was the difference between a strategist and a survivor, and in war, survival is the ultimate proof of mastery. Today, historians still debate who was greater, the inventor of the lightning war or the man who weathered it. But maybe greatness isn't found in who struck first or who hit harder. Maybe it's in who understood that wars are not won by speed alone, but by the will to think when others panic and to stand when others fall. In the end, Zhukov didn't just outsmart Guderian, he outlasted him. His patience turned the tide of a world war, his strategy saved his nation, and his resilience defined an era. Blitzkrieg taught the world how to move fast, but Zhukov taught it something far more powerful: how to never stop moving forward,